Welcome to this week's chapel at Boyce College and Southern Seminary. Our preacher of the day is Dr. Jonathan Pennington, Associate Professor of New Testament Interpretation, and for a number of years he has served as Director of the Research Doctoral Program at Southern Seminary. We appreciate his service. He's an author and New Testament scholar and professor. He's also a teacher in the local church at Sojourn East here in Louisville. He's the author of articles and books. His books include The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing, Reading the Gospels Wisely, and Heaven and Earth in the Gospel of Matthew. He's married to Tracy. They've been married for 27 years. They have 6 children, Mandy, Spence, Grant, Owen, Nathan, and Emma. He did his undergraduate work at Northern Illinois University, did his MDiv at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and then he did his PhD in Scotland at the University of St. Andrews. Now he's with us, and we're looking forward today to hearing from God's Word as he preaches the Word.
I love teaching and preaching from the Gospels, but the story I want to look at today is very odd. You know, the 4 Gospels are really at the core of the Christian faith. They are theological biographies, and they're telling us about the life story of Jesus, the God-man. This is because to be a Christian is not just to know certain doctrines or to follow certain practices, but to be a follower of a certain person, Jesus Christ. Which makes the story that we have before us today so odd. Why? Because it's one of the very few stories in the Gospels that's actually not directly about Jesus. Our text for today is from Matthew 14, verses 1 to 12, and it tells us about the gruesome and sickening death of John the Baptist. Jesus was referred to at the beginning and the end of this story in verses 1 and 12 to put John's story into the bigger story of Jesus. But this particular text from Matthew 14 focuses on a number of other people besides Jesus instead. John the Baptizer, a royal couple named Herod Antipas and his second wife Herodias, and Herodias' teenage daughter Salome. Now it turns out that these characters and their choices have something to teach us all about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. But before we can figure out what that is, we need to pay attention to what Matthew has to say. Now, the story starts off by introducing us to a VIP in Galilee in Jesus' day, Herod Antipas the Tetrarch. Now, I know you've heard the name Herod before, but the reason you've heard the name Herod so often is not quite for the reason that you think it is. The reason Herod sounds so familiar is because the New Testament and in ancient history, there were actually a bunch of different Herods. They're all related, but they're not all the same person. So you'll often be reading in the New Testament and you'll meet a Herod, for example, at Jesus' birth, during Jesus' adult ministry, the night Jesus was arrested, in Luke, in Acts, where James is martyred and Paul is arrested and defends himself. And it's easy to sort of confuse all these Herods and lump them all together. The confusing part is that Herod was a family name and that a lot of related people used it over a couple of generations. Something that's sometimes going by one name or another, sometimes Herod Antipas or Archelaus, and sometimes just going by Herod. So there were a ton of Herods. Now, I'm not sure what the technical term for a group of Herods is, whether it's a flock or a litter or a gaggle or whatever it is, but it gets very confusing when you run into Herods in the Bible. Actually, I do know what the name for a group of Herods is. It's a gang of punks, or maybe paranoid thugs, and that's how they all were. Now, it all started in the previous generation with a man named Herod who was incredibly successful and became known as Herod the Great. He was not a Jewish man, but through his relations with the Roman Empire, he was able to get to be declared king of the Jews by them, and he ruled for decades in Palestine. He was known as cruel and exacting and paranoid. Now, it's this same Herod that we meet at the beginning of Jesus' story when he tries to kill the baby Jesus in chapter 2. Well, it turns out that attempt that he made to snuff out Jesus as a potential contender for his claim as king was actually a pattern in Herod the Great's life. We know that Herod had at least 6 sons from 2 different wives, 3 of whom he killed, along with their mother, for fear that they were going to try to overthrow him. Eventually, he died, and his large kingdom over the Jewish people was broken up into 4 parts, hence the name Tetrarch that they have. 2 parts went to Archelaus, and 1 part went to Herod Antipas, and 1 part went to Philip. Now, there's a lot more we could say about each of them and how they appear in the New Testament, but our time is limited, so I will just skip that. Suffice it to say that there was a lot of backstabbing, a lot of power grabbing, a lot of paranoia, and a lot of conflict between Herod, the different Herods, and the other ruling families. So the point is this, that in first century Palestine, the time of Jesus, it was a powder keg of religious, political, economic, governmental, familial, and moral conflict, always on the verge of exploding. And somewhere around AD 30, there has been this prophet who has all of a sudden appeared out by the river Jordan, who is baptizing hundreds and thousands of people, and people are saying, and he's saying, that there's a Messiah that's coming soon. And this guy, John the Baptizer or John the Baptist, he dresses like a hipster. He's got a long beard. He eats organic food and only roasts his own coffee beans. I mean, he is a weird dude, and he can't be bought or influenced by anyone. He doesn't identify with the power structures or other religious groups. He's a man on a mission, just like the prophets of old, like Elijah and Isaiah and Jeremiah. And Herod Antipas can't just ignore this guy. Not only are the excited crowds always a problem for a ruler who's paranoid, but this has gotten very personal with John the Baptist. We see in Matthew 14, verses 3-5, that John was apparently not afraid to speak out publicly about the immorality of their governor or tetrarch. And so not only is Herod Antipas part of this gang of punks and Roman puppets, this wannabe king of the Jews, Antipas has done something that has offended almost all of his subjects. He has married the divorced wife of his own brother. And we know from other biblical accounts, and also the historian Josephus, what happened. Herodias had been married to another of Herod the Great's sons, Philip, but she was ambitious and not satisfied with her station in life, and so she divorced Philip and hooked up with his brother, who was much more powerful and up-and-coming, Herod Antipas. Now, not only was this against Jewish law, it was also a source of great political instability for Antipas because he was already married to someone else when this happened, particularly the daughter of the nearby Nabatean king. And so Antipas had made, you see, a political marriage to increase his rule, but now he has blown it all by divorcing her and marrying somebody else. All this to say, the last thing Antipas wants or need is this popular, strong wilderness prophet John, who is openly preaching that he is immoral and that it's wrong for him to marry this woman. And so what do? When you're a totalitarian ruler and someone's daring to criticize you, besides criticizing them on social media, well, you arrest them, like in China or Iran or Indonesia or communist era Romania or Nazi Germany. And this is what Herod Antipas does. He puts John in the dungeon underneath his own palace, hoping this will shut him up. So Antipas was successful in stopping John the Baptist's public ministry, but now, just when he thought things were settling down on the religious front, he starts to hear reports of something and someone even more troubling. Some dude named Yeshua, who is not only preaching that a kingdom from heaven is coming, just like John, but there are also these amazing stories that he's a healer and an exorcist and a wonder worker. And the stories are so amazing, they're almost unbelievable. But what is undeniable? That there are thousands of people following this guy. And he's not just staying put out by the River Jordan. He's traveling all over Galilee, back and forth across the lake, and people are going crazy about him. This is the worst case scenario for a paranoid and precarious ruler. And that is where our story picks up in verses 1 and 2 of Matthew 14. Let me just read this briefly for you. Now, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. That's why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now, Herod Antipas had a very clear and paranoid belief about who Jesus was. He believed Jesus had actually, the spirit of John the Baptist, risen from the dead in him. Then that introduces us to the heart of our story for today. Let me read for you verses 6-12. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guest and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." Now the king was distressed because of his oaths and his dinner guests. He ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother, and John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. Now, the occasion is a birthday party at Antipas's palace. This is not a Jewish kind of party, but a Roman one and an ancient Persian one, only for the uber wealthy and powerful. Now, in Rome, these kinds of parties were very common for emperors and others, and they involved exotic foods, often lots of wine, boisterous talk, and activities. Now, the Herodians, who were wanting to be part of this sort of upper Roman society, are throwing this kind of party. Now, all of this would be enough to make any Jewish person or us have qualms and questions about the wisdom and rightness of this kind of party, but it's even worse than that. Who becomes the night's culminating exotic dancing high point? Herodias' own daughter Salome. That is, Herod Antipas's niece and now stepdaughter becomes the female entertainment for this drunken festival. Now, Herodias certainly arranged all of this to accomplish her own goals. She sends her young daughter in among these drunken men to dance for them, and she's so successful that, as was the custom, the men lavished gifts on her, normally gold jewelry, favors of various sorts. But she's so successful that her drunken stepfather blurts out, spilling red wine on his robes, that he promises an oath that he will give her whatever she wants, taking the role of the grand host and putting on airs as this great king. Well, this is exactly what Herodias, her mother, wanted, and she seizes the opportunity. Salome goes out the door, consults with her mother, waiting in the wings like some kind of grotesque and perverted beauty pageant, and tells her what she wants. She wants the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And as with all weak men who are in power, and there are a lot of those, he is forced to choose between two bad situations he's gotten himself into. He's unwilling to break his oath and his drunken promise, because this would show him to be weak and wishy-washy and shameful. It would be a huge honor-shame issue for him among his fellow rulers. But he also may be superstitious about breaking such a solemn oath, so he caves and he gives Herodias and Salome their request. He sends word. And our flashback story about John the Baptist ends with the grisly and disgusting scene of the head of John being delivered on a platter to Herod's table. This grossly mistreated poor girl then takes it to her mother and is probably gagging. Now, are you disgusted yet? Do you feel sickened by this whole scene, this drunken party by the palace wealthy while most of the people around them are starving? This objectification of this young girl, the scheming, the manipulation, the gruesome execution, and the shaming of this righteous man, John? Well, welcome to the reality of the Bible. It is not a book of fairy tales. So what do we do with this odd story? Well, all Scripture is profitable and God-breathed and profitable for training us in righteousness, Paul reminds us. And there's so many things we could say, but for sake of time, let me just point out one of the things I think we can learn from John the Baptist and how his story ends. I think the most important thing that Matthew wants us to take away from the story of John the Baptist, and especially his death, is that we need to recalibrate our expectations for what faithfulness looks like in our lives. Let me say that again. We need to recalibrate our expectations for what faithfulness looks like in our lives. John was bold. John was faithful in all that God called him to do. But note that his faithfulness did not always look like successes and accolades and rainbows and roses and butterflies and book contracts and speaking engagements. In fact, success or faithfulness often looks like suffering, fear, and in John's case and many others, even an unjust death. And here we cannot help but remember Jesus' own teachings about this. Remember in Matthew chapter 5, how the Beatitudes conclude by emphasizing that a faithful disciple of Jesus, the ones who take his yoke upon them, their lives are going to be marked by persecution, malignment, misrepresentation, even as they are witnesses. As one commentator said it, if Christ's forerunner, John, was thus treated, let not his followers today expect to be caressed by the world. And so true it is. Now, this negative prospect for being faithful, in John's case, and really Christians' case overall, need not cause us despair or fear, but quite the opposite. We need to realize that life is very much found in learning to recalibrate our expectations for what a life of faithfulness is going to look like. It's not always going to mean, in fact, many times it will not mean that everything is going to go the way we expect and that we will be famous and loved by all. We need not be surprised when we face, even in the midst of faithfulness, setbacks, opposition, misrepresentation, failure even on our part, and when our ministries don't always end up where we thought they would, and that we may be rewarded with faithfulness with loss. Indeed, there is a mysterious and paradoxical way in which setbacks and difficulties in God's economy are precisely the means to our lives. The way we find life is more often than not, through the sufferings that accommodate being faithful. One philosopher of old times said it this way: our life is composed, like the harmony of the world, with discords as well as different tones, sweet and harsh, sharp and flat, soft and loud. If a musician only likes some of them, what could he sing? He has got to know how to use all of them and blend them together. So too we must with good and ill, which are of one substance with our life. That's the idea of embracing the soft and the hard and the sweet and the sour aspects of our life. We find life. Paul says it this way, that in his life and ministry, he experienced a continual sentence of death upon him. Why? So that he might know the power of the life that comes from the resurrected Christ. And within the wonderful Christian philosophy, we understand this earthly life is not the whole story. Many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first as well. Even though our lives may not look like great success, our faithfulness will result in the great reversal in the new age when God sets the world to right. So, friends, we must learn to recalibrate our expectations about what faithfulness will look like. If we learn anything from John the Baptist's story, is he was faithful to the end, and his ministry ended in unjust death and suffering. Now, just over 6 years ago, back in February, 21 Christian workers were publicly executed on a beach in Libya by ISIS fighters. Maybe you remember this. 20 of them were Egyptians, one was Ghanaian. These were not missionaries, they were not pastors, but they were regular Christians who were simply trying to serve and help the needy. They were captured by the ISIS caliphate and publicly executed, and then the video was distributed online in an attempt to bring fear and awe of ISIS throughout the world. Now, the Coptic Orthodox Archbishop Angeleos was in London when he heard the news of these martyrs. He was immediately interviewed by many news outlets, and he explained that for Egyptian Christians, they have often faced persecution. It's actually a much more common part of their experience, going back really to the earliest centuries of the church. And so while this execution, he says, was tragic and horrible and witnessed by the whole world, it's actually not so shocking to them as it is to us in the West. And I read a powerful interview with the Archbishop, and I was struck by a couple of things he said in particular. First, he noted the resilience that their Christian faith has always had because they have faced persecution for so long. When asked how these Egyptian Christians have learned to live with this reality, he said this, quote, "We live it with a sense of resilience, but we have never fallen into a state of either victimhood or triumphalism. But we realize that it is the cross of Christ that we are carrying. It's not the end of the road because there is a resurrection that comes after the cross and the empty tomb. And so it is in that hope that we continue to live. It's in that hope that we continue to carry that cross, knowing that it will be removed from us." This is so beautiful. Notice, neither depressed victimhood nor arrogant triumphalism. Such a great picture of Christian faithfulness, which I think was John the Baptist's model for us as well. And this is possible, you see, to live in that virtuous place of neither depressed victimhood or arrogant triumphalism by having recalibrated expectations that this is the way of the cross, this is the way of Jesus, and that our current earthly experience is not the end of our story. but instead a resurrected life and a new creation. And then the Archbishop made this incredible observation about power in the world versus power in God's eyes. He says part of the reason this video is so influential is because ISIS produced it intentionally to highlight the event of the execution. But, as the Archbishop says, it actually backfired. The real power differential was revealed. Where is the real power in this scene of this execution? It was not in these big men with swords who had to cover their faces to remain anonymous. The power was seen in these young men who were kneeling down on the beach so honorably and peacefully and with such resilience and grace. The power was in those men, not in the big, burly, sword-wielding men. In the supposed moment of weakness and brokenness, the prayer that they prayed made them infinitely more powerful. Friends, this is beautiful. This is the power of God at work by the Spirit in a person that confounds the world and all its values and power and control and expectation. These 21 modern martyrs stand in a long line that goes all the way back to John the Baptist and countless people in between. And you and I today are being invited into this way of faithfulness and joy, following the example of John and millions of others, and most of all of Jesus himself.
I've really been looking forward to this conversation with Dr. Herschel York and his wife, Tanya. We're going to be talking about marriage and ministry. To know them is to know why we're having this conversation. And I think it's a really important conversation. But I also want to say that I've reached the point in life where I recognize that I've had the joy of sharing a lot of life with a few people who've just brought great joy and satisfaction. And Herschel and Tanya, Mary and I want to say to you, we're determined to see this through to the end.
We feel the same way.
That's right. We want to be faithful to the end and do it together.
Yeah, and before we even turn to, I guess, the topic of our conversation proper, the fact is that we need people in ministry. We need friends. We need
Absolutely.
colleagues, people we can trust.
That's right. It's a great blessing of the Lord to knit your heart with other people in a common purpose and just a shared desire to honor the Lord Jesus and to do it together.
Well, and especially with couples.
Yeah.
There's it's like a family dimension, a family uniting with another family.
Absolutely.
And it is, we've loved and known your family and you the same with ours and grandchildren now, all of that experience.
Well, we each have a Henry.
We do.
Among other things.
And we have a Henry who adores you and is going to take your job.
Your Henry is so kind to write me notes and things.
It is precious.
We'll make clear that's a grandson, Henry.
Yeah, right.
We each have one. And, we really share each other's joy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that also means walking through things. I mean,
It does.
We've been through so much in
mercy.
nearly
Been through
30 years.
stuff.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. But God's gracious.
Yeah.
But it all starts before we even, think about how we as couples really came to be connected and together to walk this road in ministry. It starts with marriage. And it turns out this is pretty much God's plan for ministry. 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1. Why is that important? Why is the standard picture of the pastor a man who's a husband of one wife?
I realized that I could not do what I do without Tanya.
Right.
I'm not saying that a single man can't be a pastor, but I'm saying it's a very different thing. And I think that by far the normal pattern is that a man and a woman do this together, that there's a pastor, his wife is an incredible help who is fit for him.
Right.
And, Tanya just adds another dimension to my ministry that I could never have without her. She smooths off my rough edges. This is a terrible analogy. All right. I'll just confess to it at the beginning. Have you ever seen sheepdogs work? The way, have you ever saw the movie Babe?
I haven't seen the movie Babe. I have seen sheepdogs work. Yeah.
The way they see sheep will start going this way and the sheepdog will go around that way and bring them back. I want you to know that while I'm sort of out front leading, Tanya has this incredible sense for people that are drifting this way, that way, and she retrieves them. She goes after them. She brings them in. It's a phenomenal blessing for me that she has this sixth sense about how to reach people, encourage people, love people. That I admire and respect so much.
Yeah. Well, and he said, when he used the phrase that I'm suitable for him, it is uncanny how his weaknesses, the Lord has used a strength of mine to be those things, and how he's just in ministry specifically sort of.
Yeah, we truly complement one another.
Yeah, I was in a conversation just the other day, and someone said, "I'm just amazed you know this." I said, "Well, actually, I don't know this, but Mary knows this."
This is true.
And Mary made sure I knew this before we had this conversation.
Right.
That's right.
And it's not just that she knows these things; it's she cares so much. She loves so much, you know.
Absolutely.
And I was talking to a husband today in a conversation, and I said, "You know, there's a sense in which I don't know how any of this works because I think we as husbands." Tend to think about what needs to be done. And we're not going to be able to rest unless that's done. And if we have to make sure that all the emotions are in the right place before things get done, they never get done. But on the other hand, I'm just amazed how much better I am at my job. Because Mary is, you know, she's always there to, smooth off the rough places.
That's right. I think you
or
and
to
I,
do her best. I
you and I see this in each other a lot. That we are made so much better by our wives than we ever could be alone. And I think this is really the both the desire and the product of a good marriage is that you become more than you ever could have been without one another.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that I've done that for Tanya. I know she's done that for me, and together we're so much more than we ever could have been in ourselves, because it's an incredible sanctifying grace that the Lord uses that forces you to deal with your stuff.
Right.
And being married to her, I can't just say, "Oh, I'm going to leave this weakness a weakness."
Yeah.
For her sake, I have to deal with it. Often at her behest, I have to deal with it.
So Tanya, I want to ask you directly. When you said yes to Herschel, to marriage, did you know a life of ministry was ahead of you?
I knew a life of ministry was ahead of me. I had no idea what that looked like and meant. And it was a good thing I didn't, because I would have been overwhelmed and thought, no one can even visualize himself being equipped for such a task. It's monumental. And, you know, like I was even thinking, it is unlike any other vocation, this calling, because you have to, I mean, it's just so many things. Everything matters in your life. Like if Herschel were a physician, how he loves his wife and how he raises his sons and how he is hospitable, how our home is hospitable, it doesn't bear the same weight.
Wouldn't even necessarily affect it at all.
Well, there's no biblical standard that a physician's children have to be walking with the Lord.
That's exactly right.
But there is about the teaching elder, the pastor.
Absolutely. So you get all those things, and if I had known it before, it would have scared me to death.
Now, to be fair, on the very first date, I laid it out for her and said,
He did.
"Here's what I think the Lord's going to do with my life, and are you up for it? Because if you're not, there won't be a second date."
I can see you doing that.
I did it,
right.
and she said, "I'm up for it." And 13 days later, the rings were bought. It was just that sudden. Everybody around us was freaking out. We waited, we got married 6 months later, which, by the way, as we record this, we're 2 weeks away from our 40th anniversary.
Can you believe
Well,
that?
congratulations.
40, thanks,
So-
Yeah. Well, you guys are getting old.
I know,
We are getting old.
We're feeling it, too.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, we're right with you. Yeah. This is the way this works.
that's right.
But there's a sweetness in that.
Absolutely.
I mean, I know how great it was to
So-
get married when we got
Oh,
married.
yes.
But it's 1,000 times more important, I
Oh,
think, to
yeah.
be married now that I've been married Mary and I have been married almost 40 years.
Yeah, and growing old together is a sweet thing. It's part of the course of this world that the Lord's given us. And
Yeah.
man, there's just no one I'd rather take this journey with than Tanya. We've we've just grown to know each other and appreciate each other. There's a sweetness in it, even in things you suffer through together. We recently had COVID together, and there was just a sweetness in the way we cared for each other in that, and you don't just
in
drop
sickness
into
and
that.
in health.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Better or worse, and we've been through both of those things.
So, what would you say to young people, young pastors, also seminary students, college students? They're thinking these things through, and one of the healthiest things I see on this campus is just the sea of young couples and young families. And then another very healthy thing is how many young people not yet married are really before the Lord, seeking to find the right husband, the right wife. So what would you say to them as a word of encouragement?
I think you should only marry someone that you really are committed to love them more than you love yourself. And it gets down to that choice. It's the cold, hard, rational decision to put someone else before yourself. And that's what marriage is. And it's on a daily basis. What I have at stake here is not my own happiness. It's a picture of the glory of Christ. And God takes it very seriously when we don't picture what he wants us to picture accurately. This is why the Lord's Supper matters and baptism matters. Right. And marriage matters because it's a picture of the love of Christ for his church. So I have to show that every day in the same way she's picturing the response of the church to Christ. And one of the things that we've tried to remind each other of and ourselves of is that so much more is at stake, and that the reputation of Jesus is at stake. And so I would advise anyone who's considering marriage to make sure that you're choosing the person that you're willing to do that with. And when you make it about the glory of Christ, it's amazing how much happiness will show up. But if you make it about happiness, it will always prove elusive.
Yeah, we've made the statement that in many ways marriage belongs more to the Lord than it does to us.
Right.
And to really recognize that. And so you steward that knowing it's his and this thing. But what I would say is your marriage will not be neutral in ministry. It will enhance your ministry or it will diminish it.
And we've seen both, right?
Oh,
Yeah,
mercy.
that's right.
Yeah, and
And
like your marriage
yes.
to Mary Moeller, I cannot even begin to imagine where you would be and where ministry would be without her. She has enhanced it, and I pray same for.
I would have blown something up somewhere.
Oh, you would have, without
Absolutely.
no doubt.
Yeah. It's funny because theologically, I don't have this view that like there's just this one person out there for you. But in practice, in practice, I can't imagine. Look,
No, let me just bounce back at you because I was going to bring that up.
Yeah.
And so I'm jousting with you.
Yeah.
I do believe there's this one person you're supposed to be married to, and it's the person you're married to.
That's
There we
that's
go.
exactly
That's
right.
right.
Because
There
what
we
God
go.
has joined together,
Right.
Jesus
Right.
said, let no
That's
man
right.
put asunder.
Exactly.
But on the front end, I don't think it's a matter of you like playing pin the tail on the donkey
No,
and trying to find.
no.
But once that person is chosen, that is your person. That's exactly right.
Right.
In hindsight, you can say this is the one person. There's no question
Right.
about it. In foresight, it's not as clear. But once you make the choice, it's done.
But I think rather than that being scary, it ought to be comforting. So let me put it this way:
Yeah.
you only get one shot at this in ministry. That's it. And God's plan is you only get one shot at marriage. Unless there's the death of a spouse, and that's a different situation. But I think a lot of young people look at that and they say, "Well, the risk is that I'm going to marry the wrong person." And that's a risk in the sense that you can make bad decisions that way. Right. But on the other hand, the Bible doesn't present that as a daunting issue that should immobilize us. It basically says, again, if God puts you together, then you're together.
That's right.
And you are meant for each other. And out of all of humanity ever who have lived or will ever live, this is the one person to whom you're going to be united in marriage. And that takes a lot of pressure off.
It does, but it also forces decisions, and that decision is to make this work.
Right.
We could tell you stories of times we wanted to end it, While I was in seminary. Yeah.
Just,
While I was in seminary, I'll never forget. We lived out in the middle of a cotton field in eastern Arkansas.
Oh.
And I remember one day I said, I'm done. And she said, good. And I walked out to our little car and I stood there thinking, what are you going to do now? You're going to leave her with two little boys in the middle of a cotton field? You're going to take your only car? What? And then what? What are you going to do?
Right.
And
I know you well enough to know you'd figured out you were an idiot before you got to the car.
That's exactly right. I turned around and walked back in and I said, I can't do this. She goes, I know.
Well, I mean, this is it. And it really is a comfort. I think the secular world looks at that and says, well, that's a limitation upon your personal autonomy. And our answer is, you got that right.
That's exactly right.
You got that exactly right. Yeah. Autonomous human beings are, number one, impossible, but number two, miserable.
That's right. And the minute you become a follower of Christ, you've picked up a cross. Mm-hmm. And that's an instrument of your own death. And to lay down, if you lay down and die, what rights do you have? What course of action do you have? All you get to do is die for the glory of Christ. And when you start looking at it that way, then it really does change, first of all, your expectations, and secondly, your demands. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's that comes and goes. I'd love to say that, we conquered that 12 years ago. No, that's part of your daily crucifying flesh, that you have to come to understand that this is not about me, it's about the glory of the Lord. But as I said, so often when you just allow the glory of Jesus to be your motive, happiness just shows up. And I mean, I can't imagine two people more deliriously happy with one another than we are.
But we work really hard at it, to be honest, too. I mean, like, we are conscious.
And you're still working at it.
Yes.
Really,
I used to think one of these days we're going to get to this point where it will just be so easy and I will not have frustrations and he won't need to correct certain, that never happens. There are some things that are easier, but still, you don't arrive.
And then you change.
And then you change.
She's not the girl I married as a 20-year-old. She's a very sophisticated woman now. Age changes you, experience changes you, life changes you, your body changes, all these things.
And that's another point of this that I think is really important, which is that if you really understand marriage, you understand you will never know who you would have been. Say, you get married in your 20s, you're in your 60s, you'll never know who you would have been without marrying this woman and or marrying this man.
And nor do I want to. I shudder to think who I would have been without her.
Yeah. And you think about this, a part of the Christian life is recognizing, I came to the Lord when I was 9, the Lord's worked in my life this way. I have no idea who I'd be without Jesus, but I don't want to meet him. Mm-hmm. And in another sense, of marriage, a part of God's plan. So thank you for sharing your happiness with us and some good words of encouragement. And the four of us need to get together
Let's do it.
again real soon.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Well, let me just begin by saying it is an honor to be able to share my testimony with the Southern Seminary community, because it has not always been an honor for me. At least I have not always been eager to share my testimony, and that is part of my testimony. But I'll circle back to that. And let me just begin by saying I grew up in a home in southern Illinois, just outside of St. Louis in Belleville, Illinois. And I grew up with loving parents who loved me and who loved Jesus and who wanted me to love Jesus as well. And I don't really remember much of my early years and much of what my parents would talk to me about, but I get to see glimpses of that with how my mom interacts with my children. As she plays with them outside, for example, she will quickly find ways to point them to the trees, to point them to the clouds or to the animals that are scurrying around, and she will tell them, God made those. Not only did he make those, but he sustains those. That she is so quick to point them to the glory of God and his work in creation. And that's what my mom and my dad did for me, always pointing me to the glory of God and his gospel. Not just my mom, though, but also my local church. that I grew up in a local church that taught the gospel. The pastor taught the gospel, faithful Sunday school teachers and faithful lay people investing in me and in others to teach the gospel. And so it was that at an early age, I came to know Christ, that God in his grace to use those things, that I might see his glory and recognize the truths of the gospel and turn to Christ as my Savior. But it was a little bit later down the road that it was often people would say, you can evangelize by sharing your testimony. And I began to hear other people do this, share their testimonies, and I was amazed at how some people would talk, how they went from drug dealer to pastor or millionaire to missionary. And not only this, but also Paul in the scriptures, how Paul went from persecutor of Christians to then proclaimer of Christ. And I began to think of my testimony growing up in the church, knowing Christ at a young age, as rather milquetoast, as rather boring. I didn't see it as interesting, as amazing. And I began to think, even though I know how foolish this sounds, I began to think, if only I grew up a little bit worse, then my testimony, then it would be wonderful. If only I grew up egging pastors' houses, or better, graffitiing seminary presidents' houses, then my testimony would be miraculous. Of course, I recognize now how foolish that is. And as God began to work on my heart more, I recognized then how foolish it was, that I do have a miraculous testimony, that I was a sinner, an enemy of God, and God sent his son, his only son, to die that I, the enemy, might be brought in as a son in the family of God. Not only this, but that I was dead in my transgressions and sins, and he resurrected me. He made me alive by faith in his son. It's hard to think of anything more miraculous than that. And so it was sometime after this that I began to get more serious about what I did in the local church and how I learned and taking in the glories of the gospel. But as of yet, I really didn't have any aspirations toward ministry. But I can remember when God began to move my heart in that direction. I was sitting at a Dairy Queen with the wonderful woman who is now my wife, and we were talking about all sorts of random things, and for some seemingly random reason, I began to think I should tell her I want to be a pastor. I sort of shooed the thought away, but then it came up again. I should tell her I want to be a pastor. So I blurted it out. I told her I want to be a pastor. And she asked me a difficult question. Why? And I realized as she asked, I had no answer whatsoever to the why question. So I made up some sort of answer, and we moved on quickly to another topic. It was the very next day. I didn't tell anyone about the conversation, didn't speak with my family, but it was the very next day that I was in the car with my mom. And she turned to me and said, "Taylor, I want to tell you something that I have never told you before." Nervously, I inquired about what that was, and she informed me that my grandpa, who was the pastor of my home church at the time when I was born, did my baby dedication. And when he did something that normally is not a part of baby dedications. He prayed for me that I would be used in ministry as a pastor. I was blown away by that conversation. I hadn't told my mom, but immediately I began to tell her what had happened just the night before, in that I seemingly randomly told my wife, Emily, that I wanted to be a pastor. And now this was coming out of her mouth. I don't know exactly how God was working in that instance and how he continued to work from there, but I don't see it as a coincidence, but rather that I said it for myself before my mom said it for me. Almost as if it's not just what your mom wants you to do, it's not just what your grandfather wanted for you, but this is something of God. That's when I really began to get more serious about theological education and taking part in my local church. From after high school, I enrolled at Midwestern College, now Spurgeon College, and I was honored to be able to learn there under the wonderful faculty there at Midwestern College, and at the same time then able to serve as a youth pastor, serve in ministry. It was after Midwestern that I was brought here to Southern, and I now am able to learn under more wonderful faculty, world-class faculty, as well as pastor a church in Southern Indiana, Olytic Baptist Church, that God has been working through and moving in mighty ways there at Olytic Baptist, a congregation that is seeking more and more to love Jesus. So it is with honor then that I really can say God has done wonderful things in my life, and I am honored to share my testimony.
Now